Welcome to Oracle Application Express Advanced Topics, Authentication Schemes. When we created a new application way back at the beginning of our lessons, we were given the choice of choosing what type of authentication scheme we want to use. Just to refresh your memory, I'm going to walk through the steps of the wizard to create a new application. I'm just going to leave these default values here for now. I'm not going to add any pages. I'm not going to use any shared components. And here you see I can select what type of authentication scheme I want to use. By default, we have two different types of authentication schemes defined for us: Application Express and Database Account. If I use Application Express, I'll have to create users inside of my workspace to access my application. If I use Database Account, I can use existing users inside the database as my users in my Oracle Application Express application. These, however, are not the only two options I have available to me in terms of authenticating users for my applications. I'm going to click Cancel, and I'm going to go to the Movie Tracker database that we've been using up to this point. I click on Edit, and then I click on Shared Components. You'll notice that there's a security section here with something called Authentication Schemes. If I click on that, I have the ability to create new authentication schemes that can be used inside this application. When I walked through the process earlier, an Application Express authentication scheme, which uses Application Express accounts, was created for me because that's what I selected in the wizard. I can either modify the existing authentication scheme, or I could create a new authentication scheme that can be made available for my application. If I click on Create, I can create a new scheme based on a pre-configured scheme from the gallery, or as a copy of an existing authentication scheme. This is really useful if you've created an existing authentication scheme for another application and you don't want to have to go through the work of recreating it all over again for this new application. You can simply copy an existing authentication scheme that's part of your workspace. To show you all the different options, I'm going to select based on a pre-configured scheme from the gallery for this page of the wizard. I have to give it a unique name, so I'll just give it Chris1. But under scheme type, I can select from all these different types of authentication methods for my application. I can choose from Application Express accounts or database accounts. Those are the two that come predefined by default. But I now have all these different options available to me. I can create a custom authentication scheme where I can write the code for my authentication inside my application. I can use HTTP header variables. This is not a very common way of creating an authentication scheme in Apex any longer. I can interface with an LDAP directory. This is incredibly useful for large organizations who don't want to have to recreate hundreds and hundreds of users inside of Oracle Application Express. I also have these very limited use case scenarios called no authentication using DADs, and a DAD stands for a database access descriptor, open door credentials, or using the Oracle Application Server single sign-on. Let's take a look at some of the more common ones that we'll use. If I select Custom, I'm then presented with a page where I have to enter a bunch of information for my authentication scheme. You can read all of the information in all of Oracle's documentation, but you can get a real good feel for the types of information that you have to put in here simply by hovering your mouse over each one of the titles and clicking. So under Settings, we have to enter something called a Sentry function name, the name of a function that is executed by the Oracle Application Express engine at the start of any request made to that engine before each page is shown or processed or an AJAX request is issued. If the function returns false, perhaps indicating that the user isn't logged in, this marks the session as not valid, and the invalid session procedure is invoked. Here's the invalid session procedure name. And it even gives you an example of the types of things that you can do to create your own custom authentication scheme. The authentication function name, and the post-logout procedure name. So these are all PL/SQL procedures and functions inside of your database that are going to be used as a supplemental or custom way of authenticating users inside of your Apex application. If we change this drop-down box from custom to something different like LDAP directory, the page automatically refreshes itself with all of the information needed to set up this particular authentication scheme. So if I change it to LDAP directory, I now have the ability to put information about my LDAP directory host, the port number if it's using secure sockets layer, the DN string, the LDAP username edit functions. And again, if I need any more information about this, I can simply click on the title for each one of these inputs and get more information for what I need. Most of the time, these brief descriptions of the fields are satisfactory for you to set up an authentication scheme. But if they aren't, Oracle's documentation will give you a lot more information by clicking on the help link here in each one of these windows. If I click on the help link, I'm taken to the documentation page for Oracle Application Express. I can then go in and look for the information that I'll need to get additional information about each one of these prompts.